As we move into the panel discussions today, a few technical reminders. Please use the Q&A feature to ask questions during the panel, and we'll be sure to transmit them to the session moderators so that they can incorporate them in the discussions. Additionally, Zoom has closed captioning available, so just click on the button in the bottom right if you would like to read along with the presenters. So without further ado, we'll kick off our first morning session, which will focus on the benefits of partnership to accelerate positive environmental impacts, and we'll explore the potential impacts of in-depth collaboration between research institutions and the private sector. Our moderator for this session is Olivier Berné, research scientist from the French National Center for Scientific Research. Olivier is a research scientist in astronomy in Toulouse, specializing in infrared observations of star and planet-forming regions. Together with Tamara Ben-Ari, who spoke in a session on Monday, Olivier co-founded Labos 1.5 initiative, which gathers hundreds of scientists in France with the objective to decrease the environmental footprint of academic research. Olivier will introduce the panelists and provide some brief framing remarks. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Erika. Let me start by thanking the organizers of this meeting, both from the French Embassy and the Global Council for Science and the Environment. So it's a pleasure for me to moderate this session. It's not a subject that I am yet very comfortable with, but it's also very interesting for me to learn from this type of session. As Erika mentioned, I am a researcher in the public sector, so I'm an astrophysicist. So the world of industry is something that is probably as strange to you as the depths of space. So I will try to moderate this session as best as I can, and I think so the framing for this session is really to try and understand what are the interactions that are possible between the private sector and the public sector in terms of engaging our transition to something that is more sustainable. And you know, companies have been targeting a net zero carbon footprint, and so there is a lot of movement in the private sector, and the public sector. There's also a lot of activity. Of course, scientific research has been on the forefront because they are the people who really address the scientific evidence for climate change. And now there is also a very important movement in trying to also engage in a transition towards something that is more sustainable. So we will have during this session four speakers. So Anne-Hélène Prieur, Lynda Hopkins, Jean-François Soussana, and Serena Sowers. That's the order of the speakers. And I think we can start right now with a presentation by Anne-Hélène Prieur. So Anne-Hélène is the head of the Department of Environment and Ecosystems and Biological Resources at the INRAE, the French National Research Agency, which is the equivalent of the NSF in the United States. And she has worked in several research organizations in France and in the UK in the field of biodiversity and ecosystem functioning before joining international research programs. So Anne-Hélène, it's the mic is open to you.
Thank you very much, Olivier, and good morning for some of you, or good afternoon for the.
Thank you so much, Olivier. I'm grateful to attend the symposium today. I'm going to start with a bit of a problem statement and then move to the solutions that we have found here in Sonoma County. You know, there's a phrase that's been on my mind a lot lately, morituri te salutant. That is what supposedly gladiators said to the emperor when they entered the Colosseum. Those who are about to die salute you. In California, I like to think that we are facing the 2021 fire season with the same grim resignation that the gladiators brought. Incensi te salutant, those who are about to burn salute you. It's early June. Local reservoir and vegetation moisture levels are already at record lows here in Sonoma County. My wedding album, my family's passports, birth certificates, and social security cards are packed in a plastic bin with good handles. Favorite pieces of art and framed photographs no longer hang on my walls. They're tucked in totes near the door, ready to grab, ready to evacuate. When I bought my home, the landscaping around the house reminded me of a French garden, but now my home is mostly ringed by dirt. The garden in many places is scraped to bare mineral soil, as the wildland firefighters advise us to. This creates defensible space, and it also saves water. Both are equally critical now. We are in the midst of what is likely Sonoma County's drought of record. A local rain gauge with a record dating back to 1897 logged the current and prior water years as the first and second lowest rainfalls ever recorded. A state water official called the current drought unprecedented and likened it to the Dust Bowl. What's worse is that this drought follows 4 years of record-setting Northern California fire seasons, a span of time that has given us the largest, costliest, deadliest, and most destructive fires in the state's recorded history. We've grown tired of the word unprecedented here. We've set new records for fire size, response cost, economic damage, human fatalities, and structures destroyed, only to have those records broken by an even more catastrophic fire the following year. You know, it wasn't always this way. All 5 of the largest California wildfires on record have burned within the last 3 years. 7 of the 10 most destructive California wildfires on record occurred within the last decade. We are ground zero for climate change here, and for us, it means wildfire and drought. More than 1.6 million hectares, or more than 4 million acres in California, were blackened last year. That is roughly the size of Puerto Rico. It's also more than double the previous record, which was 650,000 hectares, a record that was set just in 2018. And so far, 2021 is tracking ahead of 2020. From January through May, 4 times as many acres had burned this year than burned over the same time span in 2020. But despite all of this, I'm actually hopeful. I'm a director of Sonoma Water, a special district located in Santa Rosa, California, about an hour north of San Francisco. We're a wholesale water provider. We provide drinking water to cities and water districts that serves more than 600,000 residents in our region. We manage 2 reservoirs, Lake Sonoma and Lake Mendocino, with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And since we are speaking today about the benefits of partnership to accelerate positive environmental impacts, I'd like to share 3 concrete examples of ways that we are adapting to and mitigating climate change at Sonoma Water. Specifically, we're leveraging the knowledge and experience of university systems to help achieve our climate action goals and to implement innovative solutions. The first example is an initiative called Carbon-Free Water by 2015. Now, Sonoma Water is actually one of the largest energy users in Sonoma County. We treat, pump, and distribute water and wastewater for Sonoma and Marin counties. In 2015, Sonoma Water achieved the goal of operating a carbon-free water system. Our commitment to carbon-free water means that Sonoma Water is devoted to solely utilizing energy that comes from non-fossil fuel-based resources. UC Santa Barbara graduate students helped develop the idea of creating a carbon-free water by 2015 program. Specifically, Dr. Robert Wilkinson from the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at the University of California, Santa Barbara helped lead this partnership. And now, for the past 6 years, Sonoma Water has contracted to procure over 99% of our electricity needs through renewable and non-fossil fuel-based resources, thus achieving a carbon-neutral electricity supply to power our water systems. We have 4 solar projects totaling about 2 megawatts, which on average amounts to 5% of our total electricity needs. And 20% of our procured electricity comes from local sources within Sonoma County, so we are also supporting the local economy and creating green jobs. The second example of partnership is wildfire mitigation. As I mentioned earlier, wildfire is one of the biggest climate threats that California faces. Wildfire prevention is a major watershed protection tool for us, and we rely on healthy watersheds for our drinking water supplies. So to help prevent and stop the spread of wildfires, Sonoma Water collaborated with the University of Nevada, Reno Seismological Lab to establish wildfire cameras throughout our region. A network of fire cameras now provides early detection of wildfires in areas such as the Lake Sonoma watershed, where drinking water for more than 600,000 residents in Sonoma and Marin counties is stored. These systems have proven successful, having assisted in monitoring more than 350 fires over just the past 2 years. They're used by fire managers with the U.S. Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Forest Service, CAL FIRE, and local fire protection districts. Also, the data is publicly available at alertwildfire.org, so anyone can access it. The third example I have to share is mitigating droughts and floods. 2.5 years ago, believe it or not, Sonoma County was experiencing our 6th largest flood on record. Now we are in our drought of record. And this is unfortunately our new climate reality, vacillating between drought and flood with regular intervals of wildfire. The good news is that FIRO, or forecast-informed reservoir operations, have enabled us to better prepare for both drought and flood. And in 2013, Sonoma Water began this partnership with Dr. Marty Ralph at the Center for Western Weather and Water Extremes at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography. The partnership was designed to advance research in ocean science, meteorology, and specifically atmospheric rivers, or ARs. Flooding and water supply in the Russian River Basin are driven almost entirely by ARs. So the success of FIRO at Lake Mendocino depends entirely on research to improve AR forecasting. So what is FIRO? FIRO is a flexible water management approach that uses data from watershed monitoring and improved weather forecasting to help water managers selectively retain or release water from reservoirs for increased resilience to droughts and flood. FIRO applies emerging science and technology to optimize water resources and adapt to climate change without costly infrastructure. In fact, FIRO saved over 11,000 acre-feet of water in one of our lakes, Lake Mendocino, or roughly 1/3 of the current water supply storage left in the lake. Every drop of water is critical to save during a drought, so this FIRO water is truly priceless. In Sonoma County, partnerships with academic institutions help us deliver on-the-ground results. And these kinds of partnerships are critical to adapting to our new climate reality. So we look forward to continuing the spirit of innovation and collaboration with our academic partners in the years to come, and appreciate the opportunity to share some of these successes with you today.
Thank you very much, Lynda, for this very inspiring talk. I personally have many questions to ask, but I don't want to use everyone's time. Maybe just one quick comment. I was yesterday at the meeting of the French Society of Astronomy and Astrophysics, and we had a special session with Valérie Masson-Delmotte. We were sharing a talk, and she is a chair of the IPCC Group 1. And I think what you're describing, she was mentioning these events and the association of these extreme events, in particular those in California, to climate change, I think are extremely clear now from a scientific point of view. And I want to really make this clear, take the opportunity to make this clear. Maybe one very quick question for you, because that's a subject really of interest for me, and I think for many people, is how did you get in touch with these academics? Because the way you say it, it seems very easy, that you just rang the bell of the University of Nevada and they gave you a solution to your issue. But I'm sure that in real life, it's not that easy. So what is your, do you have specific connections with universities, with the academic world? How did that work?
That's a great question. And, believe it or not, a lot of the connections just come from attending conferences like this and meeting people and forging those relationships, and then picking up the phone and trying to think outside of the box of ways that we can come together and collaborate. I think it's also important to approach those relationships without a fear of failure, right? Of sort of knowing that you might be taking a risk, that you might be going out on a limb. The answer might be no, but it might be yes, and you might be able to do something that is truly innovative. So I would say that it's so important to come to those places. Now it's happening virtually, which makes it even easier. Before, it was always in person, but just having those conversations before and after these kinds of symposiums, and having that opportunity to establish that relationship, make that connection, take that business card, and then follow up afterwards.
Okay, thank you very much. One very quick question. Are those trees behind you sequoia trees?
Redwoods, actually.
Redwoods.
Similar,
okay.
But yes, California
okay.
redwoods.
That will be my last question. We can move to the next talk by Jean-François Soussana. Jean-François is the vice chair of the International Affairs at the French National Research Institute for Agriculture, Food and the Environment, INRAE, in France. So he is a member of the Working Group 2 of the IPCC since 1998. And he was the lead author for the 3rd, 4th, and 5th assessment reports, and of the special report on the climate change and land. Go ahead, Jean-François.
So thank you. Thank you to the organizers for the invitation, and thank you, Olivier. think it was really inspiring to hear the talk from your perspective in Sonoma County. Lynda, thank you for this. And I'm going to carry on this climate change issue. And what I would like to introduce is really why and how we could move to better use our soils in this fight against climate change and in the way we adapt to climate change. So let me start with some comments about the policy context here in Europe. We have now a climate law which targets having a climate neutral Europe by 2050 and reducing at least by 55% our greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. Interestingly, these are neat greenhouse gas emissions, meaning that you may count the storage of carbon in the biomass or in the soils. And indeed, this is an important option because we know that there is a large gap between the targets for reaching plus 1.5 degrees Celsius maximum global warming and the current pathways of emissions we have. Actually, most scenarios see that overshoot and require some negative emissions to reach the targets. So there are many options in the land sector that could come with relatively low cost and achieve negative emissions. And as you know, these are associated with forests, but also with soils. So we have really two key questions here. How can we set ambitious and credible targets for this land sector, including agriculture? And how can we bring better incentives to farmers, foresters, to create activity or business models for them? So we've been working really on this issue on can we have soil carbon sequestration in agriculture on a global scale. And this is actually linked with many initiatives. I can cite a few of those. For instance, the FAO has a large project which is called Recarbonizing Soils. Now there are also a number of private sector initiatives. In the US, they are linked to the regenerative agriculture concept, some of you may well know. And you can realize that to pay farmers, you need to certify carbon and to get carbon credit certified. So in France, we have what we call the National Low Carbon Label, and industries are now competing to get methods for certifying their carbon storage. So in this context, we have been running a European Commission funded project in the Horizon 2020 program, which has 22 partners across all continents. And we've been working with that CIRCASA project on the coordination of international soil carbon research and innovation. So what does it take? I think it's really important to see all the difficulties when you do this. You need to create a consensus between scientists and stakeholders on what sort of knowledge is needed and what sort of research and innovation is needed. So to do this, we engage with around 400 scientists worldwide, and through surveys and online meetings, we could delineate some challenges, some of them being about soil research, some of them being about agricultural practices and their role, and the others being about socioeconomics. And so we have on that side really the views from international researchers on what sort of research gaps we have and what needs to be done. But importantly, we also had a survey to more than 1,000 stakeholders, including a large number of European farmers. And there we could see what are the knowledge needs. And we could realize that a lot of this knowledge is in fact available in science, but not accessible to the stakeholders and to the farmers. So we can see that making knowledge better accessible is really key. And we could show also that farmers are most concerned by the socioeconomic issues and also by how they could tailor the existing knowledge to their local context. But there are also other stakeholders strongly concerned about methods for monitoring soil carbon. So with those two components, understanding what researchers see as gaps and understanding what stakeholders requires knowledge, we could develop a strategic research agenda, which has 4 pillars. And the first one is about academic research, so there's still work to be done and to be done with international goals. The second one is about having an international standard for monitoring changes in soil carbon stocks. And there we get a lot of interest from the private sector, from the remote sensing and space agencies, for instance. The third one is also about technological and agroecological innovations. For instance, you may need to have some efforts in plant breeding to get deep roots, to get more carbon into your soil. You may need to have better organic fertilizers. You may need to have some digital agriculture. These are just examples, but also changes in the agricultural systems. And last is about co-creation of knowledge with the stakeholders and the farmers, and how would you bring that knowledge in a better way, possibly through web apps, to the users. So now we have been completing this project and we are developing an international research consortium. We got a number of expressions of interest worldwide from research, from the private sector, from some of the public agencies, research agencies, development agencies, space agencies, and so on. And we will pursue the development of those 4 pillars with some capacity building, with some improved coordination of research and innovation and alignment of those across countries. And obviously, this takes a large effort in terms of collaborative knowledge and in terms of creating governance systems that can be adopted across countries. So this is just a short statement of where we are, and I would be glad to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Jean-François. Just maybe one very quick question for you. You mentioned the outreach, and I think this is also a subject that is of interest to all of us, you know, trying to bring knowledge to the people. And you mentioned that you try to reach the farmers, and you mentioned that you will be maybe using web apps. Is that really sufficient? Is that you know, what are the ways to reach the farmers and to tell them, okay, this is what we've been working on as scientists, for instance, or with the industry, and we think that maybe you should change your practices in such and such way. This is probably something that is very difficult to do. And my question is likely very naive, but I think it's something that maybe the answer may be of interest to many of us.
Yeah, I would not pretend we know how to do this. We realize it's very difficult. We realize that scientists and research can play a role, but there are many other components. That's why we have a pillar on what we call enabling environment, which is a mix of policies, of economic incentives like markets. Now you see the price of a ton of carbon dioxide worldwide is around €7 per ton, but in Europe it's maybe €13, and it is expected to rise quickly. And when it reaches, in European context, something between 40 and 80 euros per ton CO2, there will be really an impact on farmers. They will likely adopt this for economic reasons. So you have all this socio-economic context. You have indeed a cultural context. In some sense, we had a green revolution, which was oversimplifying farming systems. And now we are asking farmers to get back to some more complex agroecological systems. And this can only be done with them and through co-design. And this is really, you're quite right, a web app won't make it. It's really creating some support, but also having co-design. My personal vision, but I'm really over-optimistic here, is that we could have a sort of interactive online system where we would get the most of the best practices in the different countries and different local contexts, and users would be keen to exchange their knowledge and improve it with support of the scientists and so on. That's the sort of things we are trying to set up. But I do realize it's a big challenge.
Okay, thank you very much, Jean-François. So we can move to our last speaker, Serena Sowers. So Serena is a senior client manager and vice president in the public sector solutions division within Swiss RE. She works with federal, state, and local government clients to assess the risk, exposures, and contingent liabilities public entities carry on their balance sheets, and to develop customized risk transfer solutions.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the organizers for bringing together this panel, a very diverse set of panel. And I've really learned a lot from hearing from Anne-Hélène, Jean-François, and Lynda. So thank you all so much for sharing. I wanted to introduce myself and the company that I work for, and perhaps kind of give context to some of the priorities that we as Swiss Re have when it comes to focusing on climate change and some of the priorities that we have. Swiss Re is a reinsurer, and in the most fundamental way, it's insurance for insurance companies, which I'm sure is not the most thrilling of topics, perhaps, but it does give us an enterprise view of risk globally, but also very regional and focused understanding of the trends that we are seeing in markets and communities and at the individual level. So with that knowledge, we have actually been tracking climate change going back to 1970s, recognizing climate change as an existential threat, not just to the insurance industry, but as to society as a whole, compelling the need for behavioral change and shift in practices to influence how climate change is addressed as a whole. So Swiss Re has embraced this as a priority in not just our operations, but how we write business fundamentally. A few things that I will highlight here: Swiss Re has been carbon neutral going back to early 2000s, specifically since 2003, and we have aggressive operational goals and to achieve operational carbon neutrality with net zero goals for 2030, and also in how we write and underwrite our business, making specific decisions around what type of business we will not write, indicating to the industry the type of practices that is not acceptable to achieve the kind of climate future that we all should be embracing. So we take our responsibility as an industry leader to set the kind of principles and policies that we believe is essential to shift not just the insurance industry, but society as a whole towards achieving some of these aggressive goals that we need to meet in the next decade to avoid the kind of catastrophic impacts that we will all collectively experience, that we know that we'll collectively experience. One of the fundamental aspects of us coming to this point is the extensive research, both internally and in partnership with academics that we have been conducting since 1970s. One of the key findings that we came to realize was in the early 2000s, we realized that there was a huge protection gap that disproportionately affects certain communities more than others. When you look at who purchases insurance and who can afford insurance, it disproportionately affects climate change ends up disproportionately affects certain communities. So my team was specifically put in place 15 years ago after the 2004 Pacific tsunami that killed 200,000 people, but had absolutely no impact to the insurance industry. And this was a wake-up call to us that this is not an acceptable reality within the insurance industry, challenging ourselves to ask, why would this be the reality? How could this be that insurance, which we believe is really crucial to the financial backbone of society, did not have an impact after such a catastrophic event? And the reality is the difference between the insured events and the uninsured aspect was so wide, and the people who typically are covered by insurance were not the ones who are most impacted by some of these climate events. So the public sector sector solutions team that I belong to specifically works with government entities to figure out what are the types of insurance solutions that can be in place that addresses these critical needs that communities have. Because we know in the long term, governments, local communities end up paying for those who are marginalized in communities, those who don't have insurance. We find that there's a 70% protection gap globally when it comes to the kind of catastrophic events that that climate change impacts, and when we look at the local protection that the private sector actually provides. So my team's goal is to figure out how to close the protection gap, because we believe that this is critical in providing the type of resilience and sustainability that individuals need to recover from the catastrophic incidents that climate change brings. And here we really embrace three critical things. One is, how can we use insurance as a solution to mitigate climate risks and also advance the kind of energy transitions that we need to for communities to adopt in general? What are the insurance solutions that we can provide to achieve the carbon neutrality that we need? Can we invest in the infrastructure? Can we de-risk certain types of investments so that private sector can increase the type of investments that are necessary? The second one is, how do we build societal resilience? And here it's really about thinking about the most vulnerable, those who are marginalized in societies, and figuring out how we can use government, community aggregators as a way to provide insurance solutions, to distribute solutions to individuals, so individuals can start preparing for disasters before they happen, get the services that they need during the disaster, and begin recovery immediately after disaster. And here, research is critical to getting us the type of solutions that are necessary. We are talking about figuring out how to provide mitigative solutions even before a disaster happens, so we can curb the impact of the disaster. And the final one, I think, is really close to my heart, is really figuring out how we can provide accessibility to insurance solutions using digital technology, using technology and data to get the type of solutions that reaches populations that are typically not insured. And this is really in the DNA of how Swiss Re does business and how we wish to do business. And I'll end by saying we invest a lot with our internal research, but we also partner with external researchers to figure out how to advance this conversation, because this really is critical in figuring out how private sector funding can flow in, how private sector funds, when it comes to climate change insurance, can be a critical part of that. Not just the recovery process after a disastrous event, but also how can we have insurance solutions before an event? So for example, in preparation for a flooding event, in preparation for a hurricane event, we know which communities are going to be impacted. Why not have the evacuation solutions in need, where insurance triggers the payments that allows for individuals to get the care that they need, the housing that they need, the funding that they need to leave the communities that are going to be flooded before the disaster happens? Why not provide those services ahead of time? And these are the type of questions that we're asking ourselves to offer the kind of critical solutions that are necessary for quick, resilient, and sustainable recovery for communities. With that, I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Serena. I think it's interesting because you also mentioned the accessibility, and that's related to my earlier question to Jean-François in the the digital applications to reach the population. So I think this is a subject of interest to all of us, and it's true that more people in the world have cell phones than have bank accounts. So you can maybe reach a larger fraction of the population in the digital age, although I think it's only part of the solution. You said insurance as a solution. I was wondering how concretely this works, for instance, for a company like yours. This is very I'm really not familiar with this type of business, but how does that work? You go to your clients and you tell them, you should do this or that. We can insure that, but not that. And you have your policy, the company's policy behind, which is also oriented towards mitigating climate change or other objectives. Is it how that works, or because this seems very powerful in a way?
Right. We have set aggressive goals to reduce the type of insurance solutions for coal, because we believe that type of stick is necessary for shift. But perhaps I can shift the conversation a little to the type of solutions that could be empowering and enabling. And I'll share an example. We were one of the, this is one of our innovations from perhaps 15 years ago, which is a great example and application of how it can apply globally. In Kenya, and this goes back to Lynda's comments about drought issues, the government approached us about figuring out how drought was driving so many communities into warring factions because of the migrant communities that needed to find water wherever they went. So we used the data that was available, the technology that was available through satellite technology, to essentially detect as the browning of a community happened, to provide funding available so that the farmers, the migrant farmers, could access the water and food that's necessary for their cattle to avoid having to move. This essentially saved lives. This essentially saved livelihoods, and it enabled the empowerment of the community to access funding, to access private sector funding, for individual farmers to have money immediately through the mobile phones, Olivier, that you're talking about, so that they can access the food for their cattle, access essential care for their farmers, so that they can begin the recovery process. I actually think those 2 points are so linked when it comes to the stick and the carrot that the insurance industry can have. So when it comes to the type of business that we don't believe is sustainable, we can essentially indicate that these are not the type of businesses that we will insure, incentivizing that culture shift. And on the other hand, we can also incentivize the type of behavior that can shift a community towards a sustainable future, essentially providing the farmers with the funding before losing the cattle. What's the point of waiting until the cattle die to offer an insurance solution when we can prevent the cattle from dying? And I think that's the type of future that we want to move towards, where the suffering is reduced, where the impact of climate change is reduced.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's very interesting. So now I think we should move to the a more open panel to everyone, and so we have questions from the audience. There is something that is really coming back apparently in the chat, and is related to the interactions between the academic world and the industry in many different aspects. So I think France and the United States, the systems are somewhat different, but I think the general idea is the same. But I'd like to have your feedback and on your experience about these interactions with the academic world. And for those in the academic world with the private sector, maybe we can start with Jean-François, for instance. How does that work for you as being from the academic world and interacting with the private sector, with the space agencies, which are, I don't know if we can say they are public or private, and all these type of actors?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Olivier. Obviously, this is a very large issue. And I think we have to realize that obviously in private sector, we have very different components. We have non-for-profit organizations like NGOs, and certainly they do a lot in terms of advocacy, and they can help us in developing the knowledge on targets which are important for the issues that we deal with. Then you have also some companies, and there you may find some large corporates, you may find startups, you may find consultancies. It's extremely diverse. So I guess the challenge for the academia is to try to organize, if I may say, an ecosystem where you have different players and they can work together on more pre-competitive innovation. Because obviously when it comes to really competitive innovations, then it has to be bilateral and it has to be through contracts. So I think it's important to see what can be achieved that can help internationally. And for instance, when we have in mind this international standard for monitoring the soil carbon stocks, we see that most actors, in fact, all are interested, and some can really contribute. For instance, we talked with several private sector companies that they could help us by ground truthing some of the remote sensed estimates of biomass, or about soils and so on. So trying to organize also this through participatory science is another option, and then you may work more with the NGOs. So there are many possibilities, and the problem is that we need to do all this very quickly, given the magnitude of the challenge, and in very different cultural environments. That's why I think we need to have regional networks. You cannot do this only from a global perspective. And certainly we are working with some of the US-based colleagues on developing such a network in US, in North America, Canada, Mexico, and so on. So that's a perspective we have.
Thank you, Jean-François. How do any of you want to jump in and add something to that, or comment on your personal experience with the academic world, or what you want the academic world to do for you if you're in the private sector, and respectively what you want the private sector to do for you if you're in academia? Anne-Hélène, yes?
Maybe I can add one aspect from experience in discussing with other funding agencies, research funding agencies. Some of them are not able to support in a research project a partner coming from the private sector, understood in the sense that Jean-François just mentioned, so the very broad aspect of it. And that I think is something which is crucial, in that in ANR we are able to have research projects built together between the private sectors and the academic world to be funded. And I think that's a huge incentive to support that community who already wants to work together. That doesn't solve the aspect of starting a relationship, but at least that's it. And we have also a few funding instruments dedicated to private sector, which is also helpful, we found over the years, and appreciated by the community. So that's one way. And the second comment I wanted to make, which is more about the building phase. We already mentioned the trust building and knowing people and building on personal discussions, relationships, and so on. For me, that requires time and places where it can happen. So Lynda mentioned conferences, but what I have experienced in the past is that quite often it's complicated to find those places where people can be brought together and where we can do some brokering or think tank discussions and so on.
Yeah, Serena, do you want to speak up?
I would add, from our perspective, I mean, we see critical needs in innovation around the solutions that are necessary, whether when it comes to drought solutions or extreme heat impacts. So drought when it comes to the physical aspects, and extreme heat when it comes to health impacts. And here where we see the real need is piloting small solutions where we test out new ideas and fail quickly and see what works, what doesn't work, and adapting. And here's where the partnership between governments, academics, and private sector is so important, because it's not a question about how do we solve for this problem that can just be created from scratch overnight, because there's so many different problems to solve for, so many different sub-communities to solve for. So if you take extreme heat, for example, there's no one health solution that's going to solve for the kind of impending impacts of climate change on the full society that we want to solve for. It's figuring out what are the types of smaller solutions that can be developed with with governments, with academics to solve for it. And here the ask for the academia is, how can we work together to get the data that's necessary to solve for these problems? Governments have a lot of data, but it's not accessible data. Academics can access the data that private sector can't, but private sector can solve for these problems together. So it's a question of how can we come together to solve for small problems, test for those small problems together, so that we can build that trust within the community for some of these solutions that are out there.
Yes, that's a very important point that you mentioned. The access to data is today, I think, probably something very important. And I think the at least from what I can observe in France, there is a strong movement now in research to make the data as open as possible. And I'm talking about the data that is coming from scientific research, so that it can be accessible in a relatively easy way, so that it can benefit to most people. Lynda, maybe do you want to add something on this aspect?
Thank you. I just wanted to echo what Serena said, which is the idea of failing quickly. We talk about failing forward. So a failure is not necessarily a failure, right? It's an experiment. That one didn't work out, and let's try another. I do think that there are a couple things that are critical. Local government and the private sector needs to be willing to invest in knowledge, right? Knowing that not every investment will lead to an actual on-the-ground outcome. And yet I think that also the academic world needs to think also about the pragmatism of what life is like in local government. And so I really see a need for key translators between the academic world and the political world. And so, my academic background is in environmental sciences. So I'm as at home at a policy conference, right? Or, an academic conference as I am at a more political conference. And I think that the more we have people who can be those go-betweens, academics who are willing to travel with us, like Dr. Ralph does, to actually go to DC and talk to some of the funders to try to pitch the ideas. We need academics and scientists who are willing to go out on that political limb a little bit, and also politicians who quite frankly understand the science and are really willing to invest in that. So key translators, and then willing to take risks and fail forward.
That's a good point, and it's probably also really related to the education system in a way, and how these links can be made early in the careers of individuals at the university or at school. So there are also some probably things to think about from the education perspective. So we have just a couple minutes left, and so before we finish, maybe I want to just take a chance to ask you if you can say in a few words maybe what have been the most difficult things to achieve, and how you managed to overcome these issues. We can start with you, Serena.
I don't know if this is the most difficult thing, but this is a difficult problem that we're trying to solve for. We all know insurance is something that kicks in after an event, and where we really want to push the conversation is how can insurance be a before the event and during the event solution? And this is where we think data is critical. This is where partnerships between governments and academics is essential, but this is where we see the future of insurance headed.
Thanks. Lynda.
You know, I think that one of the most difficult things is just fighting against the status quo and insularity. It's so easy to sit in your own world and do your own thing. And to be honest, the thing that has overcome that the most in Sonoma County is a sense of urgency. If your home is on fire every single year, we are going to galvanize. And so actually one of my hopes is that the silver lining of our climate crisis is an increased sense of urgency and a willing to abandon business as usual and really try new things.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think there's been we didn't have time to talk about the COVID crisis, but of course it's everything is related. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, I think recently there has been a change because the physical experience of climate change is something that people are living really. And so this has changed also the way, the perception of climate change. It's not just a graph from scientists. It's something that happens, you know, right next door. So that's a big change. I think we're over time. Do I still have a little bit more time to ask Jean-François and Anne-Hélène? Erika, is that okay?
Olivier, yes. One more. Let's close out the round of questions, and then.
Okay, so Anne-Hélène and Jean-François, please make it as quick as you can. But I'd be happy to know about the great challenges that you faced. Anne-Hélène?
So maybe as a funding agencies would be the balance between science towards crossing borders, crossing sectors, and the other side that some people call the basic science, and making sure that we can fund the whole continuum, because we need to keep our science open to future challenges that we have no ideas what they would be in 20 or 30 years time. And at the same time, as it was mentioned by Serena and Lynda, responding very rapidly to the current challenges we have. But science needs some time, and building also bridges needs time, and we need to take that into account.
Thank you. Jean-François, you'll have the last word.
Thank you. I would follow with what Serena, Lynda, Anne-Hélène said, which is, yes, we need to match this sense of urgency. And for scientists, it means that we need to go beyond our own limitations. And we need, for instance, to think big, to think in a systemic way, which we were not usually trained for, because we've been trained as experts, specialists. And now we realize we need to change the world. So, this is indeed a way of thinking that is different. And for instance, now we see the role of nature-based solutions, and they can be applied to so many sectors, but you need to develop those in a very systemic way. So I think this spread of systemic thinking, matching the urgency, is something I would strongly advocate for. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-François. So thank you, thanks everyone. I think it's time to close this session. So let me thank all the panelists again and the organizers of this session.